You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. I hope your Thanksgiving was at least tolerable, perhaps even pleasant, stuffed with quiet gloating over the midterm election results, which continue to keep on giving with votes still being counted in a few places, all good for the blue team. Well, not all. It's true we certainly lost some, but mostly that was in the deep South. Georgia, Florida, and Nina Simone called it Mississippi goddamn. Those places we came so close that it was a historic result. A hair's breadth, and that hair's breadth, to mix my metaphors, creates a real foundation on which we can build and will. My guest today is quite fitting for two reasons. One reason is that, unsurprisingly, the Christian evangelical community turned out in full force for those elections, always being the major support for candidates who back anti-choice legislation, and thereafter Roe v. Wade, and aimed at the new, brisk right-wing Supreme Court. Evangelicals, well, about 80% of them voted Republican. Makes you interested in the other 20%. Are they all women? Well, we better understand more about them in any event. The second reason my guest is so apt just now is that we're coming into the holiday season, or the Christmas season. And, never mind that some of us regard it as the original solstice, while others celebrate Hanukkah and Kwanzaa. The point is that the Christian Christmas is what triumphs over the popular imagination, at least for the present. Well, anyway, it comes in second to the real winner, which is rampant consumerism. Well, you may have deduced by now, my guest is a survivor of evangelical purity culture, who escaped and who lived to tell, and wrote a riveting book about what that culture really does to girls and women. And, of course, we have the usual standbys, Surrealism Corner, Fighting Words, and where we're about to go right this minute, inside the headlines. Climate change is finally becoming a harsh reality in the minds of the American people. The international study released a few weeks ago, followed by the U.S. National Climate Assessment, both painted dystopic pictures of dire circumstances to come, or rather, already here. That's oddly comforting, ironically, because helping the public face the truth that this is not some vague future, but the present, and clearly linking climate change to the growing frequency and strength of wildfires, floods, droughts, and historically destructive storms that are already affecting the lives of people now, that's the only thing that will actually move the public, to move the politicians, to make serious change. Not Donald Trump, of course, who still cannot tell the difference between climate and weather. You'd think he'd be at least alarmed by the economic devastation climate change will bring, but he's too busy selling U.S. foreign policy for the right to build Trump hotels in Moscow, tear-gassing dangerous barefoot toddlers at the southwest border, having to withdraw the 5,800 troops he dramatically sent to the border just before the elections, and insulting the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who had, in an unprecedented public statement for a sitting chief, defended the justice system. I'm not going to get into the latest plot twists around the cast of thousands streaming out of their rat holes at the mention of the word indictment. We're moving from a period where the news broke almost hourly to one where news breaks every quarter hour, so buckle your seatbelts. But we've been waiting for this showdown. We now have the House of Representatives, and we're ready. Other news does continue and gets largely ignored, like the ruling by Judge Bernard Friedman of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan that the federal law that bans female genital mutilation is unconstitutional. rejecting arguments that the law allowed for such federal prosecution because Congress has a right to regulate commerce or health care and can enact laws to support international treaties that the U.S. has signed. He ruled instead that federalism concerns deprive Congress of the power to enact the statute, which is a local criminal activity, and thus for the states to regulate. Women's groups are pressuring federal prosecutors to appeal. Samuel Little, 75, in prison in Ector County, Texas, serving 3 life sentences for murdering 3 Los Angeles women during the 1980s, has now confessed to more than 90 murders of women in at least 14 states. Authorities say that Little gives highly credible details of the victims and the slayings. This would break the gory serial killer record previously held by Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, convicted of 49 murders of women in Washington state during the 1980s and 90s. Police and press are confused as to how a serial murderer could go on for years with no one noticing a pattern, particularly since Little was often arrested and served time for drunkenness and sexual assault. But Samuel Little is African American, and the women he described murdering were poor, addicted to alcohol or drugs, trapped in prostitution, and apparently mostly women of color. Women who wouldn't be reported, in other words, missing, for weeks and often receive fewer investigative resources. Little told investigators that his own mother had been, in his words, a lady of the night, that he had been born in jail during one of her arrests, and that he takes offense at being called a rapist because, he says, erectile problems make that impossible. In fact, this is a common condition among rapists. But his semen was found on some of the bodies because his sexual gratification is achieved by beating the women and strangling them. A clear example that sexual assault is not about sex, but about power. Nowhere in any of the reporting on this case have the words hate crimes been mentioned. The number of abortions in the United States hit a historic low in 2015, the most recent year for which data is now available, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This new CDC paper did not delve into reasons for the decline, but analysts cite improved access to birth control, among others. After surveying around 300 healthy, middle-aged women between age 40 and 60, researchers found that experiences of sexual assault can have long-lasting effects on a person's health. Surprise! The experiences were linked with clinically significant anxiety, depression, poor sleep, and high blood pressure, though the women were recruited for a study on menopause and cardiovascular disease. South Korean women should brace themselves for long-lasting effects, then. Lee Jae-rock, 75, a prominent pastor whose behavior came under scrutiny when the Me Too movement hit South Korea, has been sentenced to 15 years in prison for habitually raping female followers who said they were deceived into believing he was God. Also in South Korea, the government now says it will shut down a Japanese-funded foundation created to help Korean women forced to be sexual slaves in brothels for Japan's military during World War II. This voids the 2015 agreement between Japan and South Korea that was supposed to end a decades-old dispute surrounding women who the Japanese government euphemistically termed comfort women. The 2015 agreement, negotiated by all-male politicians, was deeply unpopular among South Koreans, particularly the few survivors, who noted that it fell short of official reparations and the declaration of legal responsibility on the part of Japan. But we can close with 2 cheerful items. Evelyn Waver Cross has become the first female Prime Minister of Aruba, and she wants nothing more than to bring lots more women into the Aruban government. And Australia finally has its own space agency and has hit the ground, well, flying. It's headed by the woman who fought to bring it into existence, Megan Clark. Live long and prosper, Megan Clark. We have to take a brief pause, but coming up is a discussion about what women are really doing inside the evangelical church, and I think it's one that will surprise you. And before that, coming right up, is the Surrealism Corner. So we'll be right back. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome back, and welcome into the Surrealism Corner. The newest sensation in China is the Real Boys Club. Yes, that's its name. It's a school so popular that it's becoming a movement. Tang Halian, its founder, is focused on training boys to be more manly. This is apparently a real concern for many Chinese, reportedly stirred by worries about military effectiveness, by a resurgence of traditional culture and roles, and by disappointing academic performance among boys. But frankly, it's mostly stirred up by the now-defunct one-child policy, which, because of the preference for sons, produced a trend of female infanticide and of sex selection abortion, leaving a surplus of males estimated as high as 10 million. Naturally, overprotective mothers and female teachers, plus androgynous rock stars, are being blamed for making boys effeminate crybabies. Surreal. Sweden always looks to the future in its own surreal way. More than 4,000 Swedes have implanted microchips in their hands. This allows them to pay for rail travel and food or enter keyless offices, all with a wave. I wonder, what happens when they're merely gesturing goodbye and find that they've bought a Lamborghini, which is way out of the Volvo price range? The Facebook meltdown is well-deserved, and Facebook's CEO, Sheryl Sandberg, who has publicly affirmed her feminism, although not lately, and you remember her lean-in clubs and her lean-in book, well, she is certainly culpable, not only in the misdeeds, but also in the shocking cover-ups. But I do find it interesting that she is the one facing intense criticism, while most press and politicians let Mark Zuckerberg, the indisputable real power of Facebook, who has concentrated its ownership and vast wealth in his own hands, he still gets off with a shrug and the reaction, well, Zuck's really a boy, and he's a little weird. I thought back to the film The Social Network, written by Aaron Sorkin, remember, that came out in 2010? And I found myself recalling the nuanced writing that did not make Zuckerberg such a hero at all. On the contrary, Facebook began with FaceMash.com, a site he created that encouraged other male students at Harvard to rate Harvard female students by their looks. He hacked into Harvard's web pages to steal the women's ID photos. When Harvard's administrative board called him out over what they termed a violation of individual privacy, he apologized, he deactivated the site, or claimed to, and he continued building other such sites, including what would become Facebook. He also claimed that all he wanted was to bring people together in communication. Sound familiar? At least 36 students, nearly 1/4 of the student body, have come down with chickenpox at a North Carolina private school, the largest outbreak in the state since the vaccine became available over 20 years ago. The school has 152 children in nursery all the way up to 6th grade, and one of the state's highest rates of religious exemptions for vaccination. Now, I think perhaps we ought to say that this smallpox outbreak is God's way of punishing them, the sins of the fathers, for having rejected science, which is God's favorite language. She's made it very clear. It's the language in which she likes to communicate. With a record 102 women elected in the midterms, it isn't surprising that several are mothers with young kids. Happily, this is forcing lawmakers to assess policies to make Capitol Hill more female-friendly and parent-friendly. Renovations are underway to install nursing stations around the Capitol. Democratic women are discussing how to best arrange the congressional schedule so parents can video chat with their kids over dinner and help with homework. And women of different ages who don't usually mingle outside the workplace, at least not in the United States, are on a new trend of their own. Cross-generational, informal get-togethers are trying to change this unmingling. One of them, called Moxie, with an exclamation point, is a free viral network, and it encourages sharing stories, concerns, and triumphs in real-life meetings at which guests have ranged from age 29 to age 93. Another group, called Travel Circles, helps women of all ages take trips to meet other women in different countries around the world. That's quite beautifully surreal. And last in our series of individual words in other languages that sum up what it would take an entire sentence in English to express, my choice today is from Italian. The word is culacino. Culacino is not iced cappuccino. Culacino is the circle mark left on a table by a wet glass. So the next time someone plunks down a glass or a cup staining your prized wood table, you can scream, "Culacino!" And though they might think you're cursing them out, you will merely be plaintively asking, "Didn't you see the coaster?" Surreal. Time for another quick break, and then we'll be right back in a discussion with a woman who was brave. She left the evangelical community and wrote a book about what she found when she left, and also what she lost. Coming right up. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
And we're back again. My guest today, Linda K. Klein, is the founder of Break Free Together. She earned a master's degree from New York University focused on American evangelical Christian gender and sexuality messaging for girls. And she is a survivor of that messaging who broke free. And she has spent over a decade working at the cross-section of faith, gender, and social change. And she's here to discuss a most interesting book that she authored called Pure: Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. Linda K. Klein. Linda, welcome. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
you've given us a really brave book. It's called Pure, and the subtitle is Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. What was the hinge point for you when you realized you had to get out? I know at one point you had Crohn's disease and almost died and didn't get treatment for fear it was bad. Was that the watershed moment?
There were so many watershed moments that I realized just how dangerous the shame culture, and I like that you use that term, shame culture.
Yeah.
It's one that I sometimes use myself instead of purity culture, because ultimately purity culture doesn't create purity; it creates shame.
Right.
So, there were a number of moments like the realization that I actually almost died from a lack of care for my body, because I had been taught that my body was to be conquered, and to be, my spirit was to reign above it, and I was to control my body, and ignore my body and suppress my body. And that moment that I realized that teaching had come to fruition and ultimately ended up threatening my life through an ignored disease was certainly one of those moments.
Yeah.
But, when I ended up leaving the evangelical community, that was yet another moment, because I was under the impression when I left the evangelical church that I would be leaving the shame, that I would be free from these shaming teachings, and that I would no longer struggle with sexual fear and anxiety as I had growing up. And I discovered that actually I was not free at all, that the shame had been so deeply internalized that it still was controlling my life ultimately, though my spirit and my mind no longer agreed with its teachings.
Very deep indeed. You went and had a pregnancy test even though you'd never had sex, because somehow if you missed a period, does that mean you had sinned in some way? Does that mean that you could be... the ignorance in which you were kept about your own body makes me crazy. And then the way you were taught to deliberately, deeply taught to abuse it, in a sense, to collaborate with the abuse of your physical presence in society. Broke off a relationship with a boy, sweet, innocent relationship, your boyfriend, because you were getting too much pleasure just from being with him, not from sex with him, just from being with him. That pleasure must be sinful. This is, I get so angry. Were you consumed at some point by rage?
I definitely have been through many stages with this. When I the first stage was fear, that really started in my 20s, when I realized that I was not free to choose or not choose this, that it had been embedded into me in a way that was a part of me now. So that was the first, step, was realizing that the shame had been so deeply internalized and I was filled with fear. Then I started to, tell my story to some of the girls I'd grown up with in the evangelical Christian church that I was raised in, and started to hear their stories told back to me in ways that was affirming, because, ultimately they told me the same stories. Though some of them were virgins and some of them had waited to have their first kiss at the altar and others had chosen to have sex before marriage, all of us, or many of us, were experiencing this same sexual fear and shame and anxiety, which for many of us was manifesting physically in ways that mimic classic PTSD. And that's when I think I started to go through the anger. It was when I started to realize that I wasn't alone and that therefore I couldn't be the problem. The problem was what we were taught, because there were too many of us experiencing it for us to be the problem. And so as I started to separate myself from the shame and started to realize that the shame was taught to me, I definitely went through a feeling of, I think, betrayal, because this was a community that I had trusted, and I don't think that they intended to, harm me by any means. I think that they were attempting to help me, but, that was certainly not the result. Yeah,
it's what I call the you too moment, when you realize it's not just you, and you're not crazy. And you took it broader and went and interviewed it feels like hundreds of women. Tell me something. For a while, there was government, to my horror, there was government support for purity culture in that abstinence-only education in schools. And then I think at the start of the Obama administration, the support for that was cut way back. I assume it has been reestablished now under Betsy DeVos and the Trump regime.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So basically what happened is we started to see money for abstinence only before marriage messaging. And some of the people who were, doing that work on the ground were these evangelical purity purveyors. And so it took a little while before the money started to flow to them, but ultimately it did. And that was really what was responsible for the purity movement that I talk about in the book. The book is really about the impact of the purity movement on these people's lives. And purity movement is something that was started by the white American evangelical church. So as you rightly mentioned, purity teachings certainly go well beyond that. And the purity movement ultimately became a purity industry because we had this government money available that infused a lot more cash into these teachings than had been there previously. So, yes, so you started to see a lot of the lessons that I grew up with in the church and that many of my interviewees grew up with in the church being taught in public schools, ostensibly and in many cases stripped of their religious component, but the cultural teachings still there. So you would still get these deeply shaming purity-based messages. So that's when you start to see, a lot of my folks who read my book will say to me, I thought I was reading about them when I started this book. I thought I was reading about those other people, And then, they come and they say, so why am I crying? Like, why is this my story? Why are these my friends' stories? I didn't grow up in the same culture as you, but these messages, are certainly baked into our society and have been for a very long time and baked into our world. And were ratcheted up by this movement that had a much greater influence than its influence on those who were raised within it.
Yeah, and they're taking it abroad as well. Sub-Saharan African countries, American Samoa. So because women in the Pacific Islands, women's movement have been mystified by why there was this sudden purity thing going on among cultures that had been the absolute opposite of shame cultures. And it was when American evangelical churches began making a real missionary outreach, which is so incredibly sad. Let's talk about possible. What do we do? At one point in the book, you talk about that evangelical Christianity, or I would say any charismatic kind of church of any religion, is about feelings. You talk about, a feeling of elevation, of momentary ecstasy, of community, of joy. What would be effective in helping these young women and older women, for that matter, in the evangelical communities find their own voices and discover that their own voices could go a long way to filling them with that joy and that awe?
Yeah, it's interesting because, one of the primary teachings of the evangelical church, and one that I really fell in love with when I joined as a young person, is this teaching about intimacy with God. The teaching is around Jesus being in your heart, literally being inside of you. And yet at the same time, we're also taught to distrust our inner voice. So it's a kind of contradictory teaching. On the one hand, you're taught God is within you, Jesus is in your heart. And on the other hand, we're taught about original sin and the idea that, you are at your root sinful and shameful and therefore cannot trust the voice inside of you because it comes from that root. So it's a confusing thing. And, one of the beautiful parts of the book that I really like is when I hand the book over to the interviewees and I ask them, what message do you have for readers? And they really had three, as I listened to all of their answers and distilled them, there were three big themes that came out. And one was, to know yourself,
right?
To actually be able to identify your thoughts, your feelings, your beliefs, right? Even that is difficult when you come from a culture where, in general, you're taught to distrust your inner voice because of the sinfulness of humankind, and doubly so if you're a woman, right?
Yeah.
Because, there are these strict gender teachings. So knowing your voice, and then another one was around trusting your voice. So really, being able to see, yes, God is, within me.
Right.
And the little gut voice that's saying this is wrong, though my pastor says it's not, who's to say that's not the Holy Spirit within me? You know?
Right.
And then the third, of course, is to know you're not alone.
Yeah.
The third piece of advice. And that is really, really important, because when we come into voice, when we start to know ourselves and trust ourselves enough that we can then say it aloud, whether it's to a close friend or whether we're ready to go online and share a little bit about our story more publicly, this incredible thing happens, and that is that we hear from others often that we're not alone, because these experiences are quite universal. One of the things that I learned over my 12-year journey was that one of the most extraordinary parts of my story was that it was absolutely ordinary.
Yeah, but you had to face death before you realized that it was killing you, and then to discover that it was ordinary. I mean, that's a double whammy.
Absolutely. But I will say, that I know that I'm not alone, and I know that we are becoming a greater number, and we are standing up and are healing ourselves and are healing each other, and that the more that we do that, and the more that we do that, outside of the shadows, change is possible.
Yes. And
it allows me to come into a trust. I hope it's all right for me to say this, as somebody who comes from a Christian perspective, a trust that, that so long as we're doing this deep work, that, that there's something bigger going on that we are a part of, that one might even call holy.
Yes. Well, I think that the human body is sacred, and I think that the thirst for freedom is sacred, and so why not?
Right.
Why not? You'd be surprised at the things that atheist grace can bestow. But I want to talk for a bit about just what is happening, your sense of what is happening with women in the evangelical community.
I think there's some really powerful work being done, and I think there's an even greater level of energy on the ground of people who know that this shame is happening and can see it, can feel it in themselves and others, and understand the church's complicity in contributing to the creation of that shame, not the only contributor, but, a significant contributor. So it does feel like there's something happening. There's something happening on the ground. People are seeing it. People are feeling it. And then there are some who are rising into voice and rising into organization. And to your point, it's an incredibly brave thing to do, particularly if you're within the evangelical community, because this is a community that collapses all of the different definitions of evangelicalism, by which I mean, there's political evangelicalism, there's religious evangelicalism, there's subculture evangelicalism, there's spiritual evangelicalism. These are all different evangelicalisms in my view, and yet they all go by the same name, and that name is Christian. And Christian is a loaded term that determines whether or not you're going to heaven. So when you've got all of these things going by the same name, it's very easy for someone to stand up and say, I disagree with these patriarchal teachings that I could see are hurting people and in some cases killing people.
Yes.
But and then to have someone come back to them and say, well, you're not a Christian.
Right. You're doomed to hell. That's right. Yes.
You're doomed to hell because you disagree with this political position. And I think that that's a problem with the fact that we are labeling all of these things by the same name.
Yes. I was going
in a way that's not helpful.
I was going to ask you, in fact, about the loyalty of the evangelical community to Trump, despite his own life's record, his attitudes toward basically everything that they would claim, you'd think, to stand for, with the exception of reproductive rights, they would define that differently than most women would. But I have also heard, and the statistics seem to back it up, that there is a slight dip in the loyalty to Trump and Trump policies in the evangelical community, and it's a dip that due to women. It's, in other words, the men are holding fast, but if there are any changes in the support, it's happening among the women.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would love to see where you saw that, if you wouldn't mind sharing it with me. The thing is, it's been really disheartening on many levels. Sure. I just read a great article in the New Republic recently where a gentleman put it into words so beautifully, and I'm going to try to summarize what he said. He said, the question is, when you've been taught these things, your whole life, and when it's created deep, deep shame, certainly the purity teachings have created so much shame and in many cases downright trauma in people's lives. It's made them feel that they are worthless, that they are not worth living, and then to see those very same things that we have suffered over, and that people have lost their lives over in some cases, to see those things then become unimportant, to say, well, he's doing these things, but who really cares?
That's right.
And that has been very, very difficult for many people to watch. And the way that this gentleman summed it up in his piece that I'll try to loosely quote is, this question of, is this people abandoning their values, or perhaps more terrifyingly, were these never real values in the first place? Was this a lie?
Exposing
that we were
what was
caught up in, in order to maintain power or create power. And that's very, very sad. And for me, I know when I, saw these values be so quickly abandoned, it was a betrayal all over again.
Of course.
Because at the very least, I want to believe that they believed.
Yes. Yeah.
I want to believe that I was hurt and I was shamed for a reason.
Exactly. And that it wasn't just arbitrary and totally cynical.
And many people believe, regardless, many people believe. The question is whether those at the top believe.
Yes.
But what is not a question is whether those of us who are in the churches day to day, on the ground, growing up in this, raising our kids with it, whether or not we believed.
You believed, yes.
We believed.
Yes, you were real. No, I mean, we don't want to blame the victim ever.
Right.
And there should be no shame in breaking free from having been shamed, if you know what I mean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, well, this is fascinating, and the book is fascinating. I mean, I really thank you for it. Again, listeners, it's called Pure: Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Young Women and How I Broke Free. And did she ever? Linda K. Klein. Thank you for the book, Linda, and thanks for the work you're doing. I know you're on book tour now, but you're traveling around the country and you talk to women's groups and you talk with women. And thank you for that work. And thanks for being with us today on Women's Media Center Live.
Thank you. This was a beautiful conversation.
And it's time for one last break, and then I'll return with some fighting words.
For the smartest talk about news, politics, sex, books, religion, race, and more, it's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Audacious, witty, provocative, informative, and fun. It's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Talk radio with a brain.
And we're back again with some fighting words. Now that the House of Representatives is back in relatively sane hands, we can look to the future, a luxury since we've been scrabbling for moment-to-moment survival. So there's the expectable debate about what priorities Democrats should address first, with some people, including naturally committee chairs, pushing for those issues that their committees happen to address. The issues are many, even just to get back to where we were before Trump and Putin stole our electoral system, and keeping in mind that the Senate is not yet in the people's hands. So many urgencies: climate change policy, immigration, infrastructure. This time actually doing the investigation into Russia's involvement in the election, investigating Trump's tax returns, investigating the Kavanaugh appointment, investigating Trump's violations of the emolument clause, moving toward impeachment. Tempting as each of these and more are on the correct the course and, let's face it, pure revenge front, I want to suggest that though all of the above are crucial, they need not be our frontline priorities. I feel that we must move to protect the Mueller investigation, and there are bills ready to do just that now that we have the numbers and will be in control of the House agenda. I also stand with people who believe we won in large part because of our emphasis on protecting and improving health care. So that's another serious priority. And I'd like to add one more peculiar one to my top three, one that only a few House members have fielded, Representative Connolly, Democrat of Virginia, among them. The census. I can almost hear you yawn. The census, how boring and irrelevant all those figures and numbers, and instead we could be investigating Trump's relationships with former porn stars and Playboy models. But let's spare a word for investigating and updating the census, which is rapidly approaching in 2020 and thus needs to be dealt with immediately. The census is the source of all policies, electoral procedures, education, allocation of benefits and subsidies, immigration and migration data, demographics on life expectancy, thus health, race/ethnicity, and sex, and more. And the Trumpists have been messing a lot with census categories, definitions, and processes. That manipulation fed into decades-long Republican drives toward gerrymandering is, in fact, why, until a few weeks ago, Trump controlled all three branches of government. Some of it has to do with naming. For instance, according to the Pew Research Center, more than a quarter of Asians and Hispanics marry outside their race/ethnicity. Are their children white? Are they minorities? Both? What about their grandchildren? Why don't we call white Americans European Americans? The whole conversation about America becoming a majority-minority country rests on precisely those definitions, which also happen to change over time. The Irish were considered the Black Irish, and the Italians swarthy, until they were considered as assimilated and became, ta-da, white. Also, many people are now afraid of deportation if they answer census questions honestly, should they have immigrants, whether legally or not here, in their home. So, invalid data results. And where women are concerned, oh my God, the census is vital. It tells us, for example, that 80% of employed women are still in sex-segregated, low-benefit, pink-collar jobs, and 2/3 of all part-time workers are female. And still, the last hired and first fired. It tells us how many of us are self-supporting moms with dependent children, how affirmative action programs with federal contracts that protect us are faring. It tells us how many of us are un- or underemployed, have credit or can't get it, are on welfare, and what our birth rates are. It affects Medicare and Medicaid policy. When the numbers are skewed through error or deliberate manipulation, real people suffer. Most of all, the census can erase women's labor. Women constitute well over 40% of the paid labor force, in addition to contributing much more than 40% of the gross domestic product in unpaid, invisible labor in the home. This last category is enormous. All that cooking, cleaning, sorting and washing, drying and folding, shopping, doing errands, driving, gardening, multitasking, and rising at 2 a.m. to deal with a sick kid. All of this, plus record-keeping, bill-paying, social life managing, and, most of all, reproducing the means of production itself, giving birth and training, that is, child-raising, the labor force itself. All of that, whether the woman is also employed outside the home in addition or not, is unpaid, invisible labor. The GDP would increase by well over 50% if it were factored in. Canada and the Scandinavian countries have already changed their censuses to factor in such invisible labor, and the category expands in agricultural areas in this country and internationally for countries where subsistence farming, herding animals, fuel gathering, water hauling, and food preservation are added in. When such life-sustaining work is valued, women are valued. Under Trump, the U.S. Census has been corrupted and weaponized into a political tool. It needs to get back to reality and to projections that impact planning and are based on fact. So that's my third urgent priority. But hey, we ought to be able to do all of that and more. Unlike the current GOP, we can walk, chew gum, legislate, and remain human beings at the same time. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter, and remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag #FightingWords. And that's our show for today. You can follow me on Twitter at @TheRobinMorgan and on Facebook at facebook.com/TheRobinMorgan. Check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book, Dark Matter, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for our show. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer of this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.